And also you touched upon how privatization is detrimental to affirmative action program. In fact, one of the main reasons why privatization this government wants to bring about is to distract affirmative action. So with this, we will now go into question and answers. So to all the attendees, if you have questions, please raise your hand, and then you will be given a chance to ask a question, or you can just write your question in the chat box, and again, I will invite you to ask your questions. So before opening the floor for questions, I have a question myself, which I will direct at Arun Kumar sir. Sir, so the government has been saying that they want to get into asset monetization to bring in FDIs and so on and so forth. But as we all know, for bringing in FDIs, either through asset monetization or for any other way, what is necessary or what any investor looks for is institution, a transparent institution. But this government, though giving a signal that they want investment, have kind of given the signal that judiciary or any other institutions are not transparent and they are arbitrary. Most of the international newspapers, such as the New York Times or even The Economist, have ridiculed the government or criticized the government for the arbitrariness of the institutions, which we could also see in the recent happenings in the court. So what is your opinion on this, sir?
So, the question that you're raising is that under what conditions will foreign direct investment come in a big way in the country? First point is
this existing institutions.
Yeah. I mean, given the situation, so the first point I want to make is that FDI is only about 5 to 6% of the total investment in the economy, whereas the overall investment dropped very sharply from 2012-13, even before the pandemic. It had peaked at 36% and had dropped to about 30% even before the pandemic, and during the pandemic it fell further. So the problem of investment is the problem of demand. Because the unorganized sector was getting hit very badly, that's why demand was not rising much, and because of the lack of increase in demand, you had this problem of investment declining, and capacity utilization was running at about 70%, as the organized sector capacity utilization figure from the RBI came. So the first thing is that how to raise investment demand. Second is, will FDI be able to overcome the investment shortfall in the Indian economy? Clearly, that is not what will do that. A third point is, how much FDI can we expect? Even before the pandemic, the foreign investment was moving out of China because of the problems that they were having in China. It was going to Vietnam, it was going to other such countries. And that is because of the lack of infrastructure in India. The turnaround time in Vietnam, etc., is very short, whereas in India, it was very high. So therefore, my own suspicion is that you don't expect too much of FDI to come into India. It is likely to go elsewhere because the infrastructure is not very good as we offer it in India. The next point is that because of the pandemic, everybody, all nations want to curtail the supply chains. They don't want long supply chains because in a disturbance, then it disturbs the production. So Mr. Trump, when he was there, he was already asking the US capital to come back to the US. So in other words, the foreign direct investment as a route to try and get more and more investment into India is unlikely to be very successful in the short run. What happens in the long run, whether we are able to build enough infrastructure, etc., whether we are able to offer concessions to foreign capital, that we cannot say. And then the point that you're raising about lack of transparency. But you see, foreign capital went to China, where the lack of transparency is even greater. So I think, it's not just going to be lack of transparency. It is really going to be what is the market that we are able to offer to foreign investment. And if that market remains short, then even the Indian investment is not going to be very big. Then foreign investment coming in is also very unlikely. Where you see foreign investment coming in today, the stock market booming, is in the technology sector, because the technology companies have done very well in the US. So whether it be Facebook or it be Amazon or Google, etc., they are flush with funds and they want to capture the technology platforms in the developing world. So that's why you see Reliance got a lot of capital from these technology companies, and therefore Reliance, which was the most indebted company in India in February 2020, by August 2020 had become debt free, because not only did it get foreign investment, but it also managed to float a rights issue, and therefore the debt completely went away. So in a sense, what is happening, what you see is that the technology companies will get investment because the foreign technology companies, they want to capture the technology platforms that are coming up in India. But if you expect investment to come into other sectors, I don't think that is where it will come. So in a sense, in spite of lack of transparency, etc., that you're pointing out about the legal system, etc., the foreign investment will come into technology sectors. It'll try and capture the technology sectors, but I don't think it'll come into many other sectors unless we are able to boost demand. So I think, we need to be very careful, and we need to generate demand within the economy so that our investment becomes much more buoyant within the economy.
So thank you so much for your detailed reply. So there's one question from DPF member Mohan Raj. His question is: growing monopoly in privatization, whether any check and balances are made to form a firm market in which the social order has already been disrupted. That is his question.
That's for whom?
Mohan Raj.
I know. So maybe Mr. Venkatachalam can.
To you.
Okay, he has not mentioned anyone from Mohan Raj. It's open.
So Mr.
Open to the floor.
Venkatachalam, you can answer that.
No, kindly. Professor,
Okay.
please.
Yeah. So, the problem with monopolies is that, you see, they don't lead to efficiency of capitalism. And that is why, as I said in my presentation, when you have large monopolies, then the problem will be that the pricing would be in their control. And even if you have regulation, then, as I said, there's gold plating. And with gold plating, you can raise prices. There can also be asset stripping. Like, for instance, the Tatas acquired the VSNL and closed it down, and they simply used the land that was available with VSNL. Similarly, BPCL and others have huge amounts of land. So when you sell it, even if they don't produce, they can use the land for purposes that they would like to use for their own purposes and make money. So therefore, these monopolies have their own, features of how they would, generate profit. And that is not necessarily going to help the people, because people need employment. People need, more production. People need control of prices, as Mr. Venkatachalam said very clearly. So, for instance, in Delhi, because of the mother dairy, what happens is that the vegetable and fruit prices don't rise, which otherwise they would have risen much further. Because of the presence of All India Institute of Medical Science, a heart surgery will not cost more than 1 lakh or 2 lakh there. So the private sector cannot charge 15 lakhs or 20 lakhs, which they could otherwise charge if they were left completely free in the field. So this asset monetization, what it will do is it'll increase the monopoly power of the private sector. And therefore, the prices that would be fixed by them, they will not be what would be optimal for society. That will be not what would be good for society. So this creation of monopolies that is going on is going to also, as I said, have social and political impact, because they'll be able to control the politics of the country. These huge monopolies with huge funds, they will be able to control the media. They'll also be able to control the politics of the country. So therefore, it's not just economic, but it's also political and social impact that will be there. So in a sense, for a well-functioning economy and a well-functioning society, it's necessary to have checks and balances and not have the creation of monopolies as is happening in the Indian economy.
So thank you very much for your detailed reply. My colleague from DPF, Pugal Gandhi sir, has a question. So please go ahead.
My question is to both Professor Arun Kumar and also to Mr. Venkatachalam. This is in relation to the sale of Air India to a private player, Tata. How do you see this sale in relation to the national monetization plan? Because here is a situation where the product is sold, but the debt is assumed by the government. Of course, in corporate legal transactions or in corporate transactions, this is not new. We hive out all the debt to create value to the product which we have. But here what has happened is the debt is assumed by the government, which is nothing but the general public. And what is being sold is only the aircrafts. It is simply an asset sale. If this method is followed with respect to even other products or other sectors, which is mentioned in the NMP, how do you feel that this will affect the economy and what is the impact of it?
Yeah, sir. Professor.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. He will speak, but my points are few. Number one, the Air India sale is with a vengeance. They just want to redo what was done some 50 years ago. It was taken away from Tata's. So I want to establish a point. I am again going to sell it back to Tata's. This is number one. That means this privatization is not just money, it is with a vengeance by the government. Number two, we know the transaction. As you rightly said, the Tatas are going to immensely benefit by this, because the liability will be taken over by the government, and whatever little liability they are going to take, about 15,000 crores, will be spread over by the banks in terms of restructuring, etc. So for a very marginal cost, the whole assets of Air India will be in the pocket of Tata. The third point is it really bad? That is the question. Air India is not bad. It was not managed properly. We all know the government was deliberately doing all these things just to call the dog mad and kill it like that. So Air India is not bad. Their policy was wrong. So it is not only Air India, BSNL, everywhere we have seen. They are deliberately weakening our public sector, showing them in bad light, and then say we want to sell. So I don't believe that Air India is bad. They want to do that, and they are doing that. And the last point is, it's a matter of shame that such a huge country with 140 crores of people, we will not have our own government airline. I know there are a lot of small miniature governments, small nations, countries, they have their airline, but India will not have our own airline. It's really a matter of shame. But the government did not bother. Somehow they're determined, and they want to show that we mean business in helping the corporates and the cronies. They are doing that. So I think Air India also needs to be more and more debated among the people. Otherwise, they will simply watch away by saying that we got this money and close the matter. Yeah. Anyway, our professor will elaborate more.
So, the way I look at it is, that one is an emotional appeal that a nation like India should also have, an airline. But there are also very strong economic reasons. There are also strategic reasons. An airline is also able to help you when you're in a crisis, whether you have to evacuate people, 20 years back from Kuwait, etc. Whether you had to run, the Vande Bharat plan to evacuate people. The private sector may not come forward and run the airlines. So, there are strategic reasons also for why, you need to have an airline which could serve strategic purposes. But as Mr. Venkatachalam is saying, that, the Air India was run to the ground. One of the mistakes that was made was to merge it with Indian Airlines, and that really led to massive problems. Second was that in the 90s, the Air India was not allowed to buy new aircraft. Whereas, Air India, the airlines industry is a rapidly changing technology. If you don't allow to buy, new aircraft, then, you will lag behind, your cost will rise. And therefore, the cost of Air India, was rising and profitability was falling. And then suddenly, after the merger, you ordered a massive number of aircraft, which you could not utilize. And therefore, the interest burden kept rising. Thirdly, of course, which is a problem with several others, because you see, of crony capitalism, you misuse the airlines. The airlines, was being used like 2 aircraft. When the Prime Minister and the President would travel, 2 aircraft were demobilized from the fleet for the use of the thing. And similarly, for many other purposes, the airlines were being misused. So this lack of autonomy of Air India from political and bureaucratic control contributed to it. Now, if the government wants Air India to run and provide subsidy, for instance, there was a time when, if you were traveling, then your spouse was also allowed to travel free. Now, what is the logic of it? If you're a government servant and traveling, and you also allow a spouse to do it quite clearly, then, you are not going to generate profit. So all kinds of social obligations, political obligations, bureaucratic control was there on Air India, which would, of course, affect its profitability. And once you become loss-making, then what will happen is that there's going to be a demotivation and demoralization of the workforce. And therefore, the workforce was demotivated and demoralized, and that is added further to it. So as you rightly said, the large amount of debt that Air India owes is as a result of the faulty policies that were being pursued. Now, inherently, it's not that the airlines cannot be run on a profit. The question is how to manage it. And that's why I said in the end that for public sector to run as public sector, you need to feed from control of the politician and the bureaucrat. It has to be accountable to the parliament. It has to be accountable to the people and not necessarily to the minister and not necessarily to the bureaucrats who are governing it. So this is a problem that our public sector has faced all the time. And I remember in 93, 94, 94, 95, when we did the alternate budget, this was a proposal that we had made that we need to free the public sector from bureaucratic and political control. And in fact, the All India Bank Employees Association was a part of our alternate budget scheme, where Mr. Tarakeshwar and others, they were also there, from the earlier generation. And they also agreed. And we'd suggested that the banks should, create a situation in which the public sector gets together and creates a higher efficiency within the public sector by pointing to the crony capitalism that has been going on within the public sector. So there are many things that need to be done. So I think the Air India situation, need not be looked purely in emotional terms, but there are strategic and economic arguments. It also is a check on the monopoly that the private sector would create. And that monopoly check is very essential, because otherwise there'll be political and social implications of that.
So thank you so much.
My only concern is, sir, will this particular model can be extended to the other sale of other assets under the monetization plan?
Yes, it is likely.
Government all the debt and only.
It's very likely, as you say, that this model is likely to play out, because they're very keen to give away the assets. And therefore, the one way to give away the assets is to take on the burden of the loan and the so on that is there on the public sector and hand it over. So this is what's happening, as you rightly said. The loan, the debt burden is 60,000 crores. That the Tatas are not going to bear. They're only going to bear 13,000 crores. The balance will be with the government. So you're handing over huge assets for very low prices, and that is what I think the problem is, which I was trying to point out, that with crony capitalism, that is very likely. That's what we saw in Russia, where the privatization of the assets took place and kleptocrats emerged, billionaires, and they all, ran away from there, and they set up houses in London and so on, where London is a financial center. So all kinds of skullduggery came up as a result of that.
Sir, thank you so much for your detailed reply. So we have 3 questions from audience. So they're actually in the panel now. So I would ask each of them to give their questions, and we could collect 4 questions together, and then we could answer. So before I ask them to go ahead with the question, I also have one question for CS Venkatachalam, sir. So how do you think this asset monetization plan is going to affect the banks, and how are you going to take care of the interests of the employees? I mean, you in the sense the employees association. So this is my question, and then we have Mr. Krishnamurthy Srinivas Rao and Francis Adikalam. So Krishnamurthy, sir, please, you can unmute yourself and go ahead with your question. If he isn't ready, then Mr. Francis Adikalam, can you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, my question is a very long one. No, you can.
No, you can be brief.
Down everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is not a question, it is an essay.
No, but so can you briefly? Yeah, can you just briefly go ahead, sir?
No, the question is mainly we don't have. Can we confront it on with a legal forum? There are so many people who are involved, who are the stakeholders in this issue. Why don't we organize them to raise against this particular issue and stall it at a particular moment? So that at least much damage can be a little bit slowed down. That's what my issue. Other point is, which I have already told, who are the stakeholders who are going to participate, who can do that some job in that, especially landholders. The landholders have been given 10 rupees, 20 rupees, they are sold the acres of land to the private public sector. Today, these whole assets are being alienated and taken for some other purpose. So why not we organize those people who have lost the land to the public sector to raise up against the government's policy of alienating the property, because the land use is now changed. Likewise, each issue has got to be, each stakeholder has got the right to raise up, and we can stall them from doing this damage. That's what my angle.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Francis Adikalam, are you ready with your question?
Yeah, I am.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead. Sir.
Chat box. Just to know, ask you, because 1991 was the period when you said Professor Arun Kumar started the whole thing. I believe that it's the last straw. Search monetization is the last straw in terms of going ahead with the monetization, because there are public services already being monetized, be it of basic services like health as well as education for that matter. Given the fact that government is also the party in power must also face the public, for election once in 5 years in India. How does it know when they're going to generate money? From where do they generate money? Because the finance minister of Tamil Nadu was saying that there are issues of concern with regard to running of the public sector. And so at one hand, they have issues of running of the public sector. On the other hand, they have to face the election. So they cannot pass much of the taxes to the people. Already we have been taxed much. So where does the, how do we go forward? What is the way out of doing this action?
And Mr. Srinivasa, can I just quickly go ahead with your question, please? Okay, if he isn't there, I think I have his question. The central government had announced a decision to dissolve the OFP and constitute 7 new DPSUs from October 1st. What will be the impact on our economy? Please explain. It's apparently an open question.
Yeah. It's very simple. All the ordnance factories, they have played a very important role in the defense production, and it is very, very unfortunate that the government has taken this line to corporatize them. We have seen corporatization is the first step, privatization will be the second step. So naturally, they will do that, and it is going to totally impact the economy, the people, the workers in that factories, etc. And the government decision is totally wrong.
Also, the question of banking sector, which was asked of you.
Yeah. No. On the asset monetization, Mr. Dharmedharan was asking the impact on banking. I don't think that it is going to be a direct impact, in the sense, unless we know that how this monetization process will be done, in which we are exposed to these assets by giving loan, then only we'll be able to know. Otherwise, the public sector which have taken loan from the banks, they have not defaulted, except one old Hindu, that photo film factory, because the whole process has started. Otherwise, public sector is not a defaulter. Only the whole default will be from private sector. So I don't think there is going to be any major impact on the banking sector because of this. Banks will not be affected. But after that, they will come to the bank for more money. Second, they may come to the bank for taking more loan at cheaper rate, which Professor also explained in his presentation. That risk is there. Because banks are now tempted to give money. They are flushed with money. Credit offtake is not there. So these people, they will come to the banks, approach the banks, take a loan at cheaper rate of interest, and then they will try to, use that money when they go for this monetization process of the government of India.
Thank you.
The government banks will be a conduit for privatization. Government unwittingly is making the government banks a broker for privatization.
Yes, I think that's quite right, that the banks are flush with funds, and therefore the private sector will try and go and borrow and use that money for asset monetization, for buying out the assets cheap. I think the question that Mr. Krishnamurthy was asking about the legal issues and whether the legal challenge can be there. Now, I think the courts have taken a position that these are policy issues. So I'm not sure how much the courts will intervene in this kind of a situation. And of course, the stakeholders like landowners who gave away the land, etc. The courts may say that, look, that was long time back, and therefore, it may not be something that, can be under the purview now. So I think it's, as Mr. Venkatachalam was saying, it has to be mobilization of the people, mobilization of the state governments, because the state governments are not consulted. And as the Honorable Finance Minister was saying, the state governments are short of resources. The pandemic has hit their resource base very badly. And therefore, if they are short of resources, they need the resources. So the state governments, I think, should be able to go and say that, look, our resource position has been weakened and this will weaken our position further, because out of this asset monetization, we are not going to get anything. So this is a central scheme out of which the state governments will not get anything. So I think the state governments can raise this issue, but otherwise I think going to the courts is not going to be a very productive thing at the moment. But yes, the various stakeholders who've been there, they of course do matter. Now the other question by Francis on 1991 and the public services provision, and how would the politicians face the public if these services go down? And I think, one of the things that we've noticed in the last 5-6 years is that there's a lot of fake news and there's always a political message that is done. You notice how demonetization impacted the poor very badly. It impacted the unorganized sector very badly. The GST impacted the unorganized sector very badly. And still, people have been voting this government to power because they create a narrative. The political narrative that they create can always trump the economic narrative. The question is that the pandemic, which impacted the poor people again very badly, will this government be able to overcome that through creating some political narrative? So I think the question becomes political. What is the political message that that is given to the public about this asset monetization and selling away the silver, the family silver? So it has to be politically packaged. It's not a purely economic thing. We know that privatization in education, privatization in health has been going on since 1991. It's now a large number of private universities, coaching centers, the fake degree rackets, etc., that have been going on as a result of all this for the last 30 years. So it's not just now, but I think, this provision of public services, which has to be better for the improvement of the country, because otherwise poverty will persist, otherwise the country will tend to flounder. I think it has to be raised at a different level, at a very political level, that the schemes that the central government is pushing forward, they are not going to help the poor people. So the divide between the rich and the poor, that is getting created as a result of these monopolies getting created. I think it has to be addressed at a very political level. That's the way I feel. We can always point to, how the private sector in education, private sector in health, it has created problems, especially in the pandemic. Now, large number of children are having to leave private sector schools and go to public schools. And the annual survey of education report points out that 50% children in rural schools in the 5th class cannot read 2nd class textbook, cannot do 2nd class writing, cannot do 2nd class maths. And as a result, you are assured of 50% poverty for the next 50 years, because these children who will drop out after the 8th class will never be able to do a modern job and will never be able to get a above poverty line income. So you can, create narratives around what it will mean in the long run, but people are looking for the short run. What can you do on education? What can you do on health, etc.? So in the short run, I think this political message has to go through that this government is very pro-corporate, very pro-big business, and so on. And therefore, the poor people are suffering. So I think the political messaging of this lack of provision of services, the public services, I think that political messaging is very important. Now, regarding Mr. Srinivas Rao's question of the defense sector, I was the team leader of the Indo-Russian team for the pricing of the Sukhoi aircraft in 2012 to 2014. And I saw the functioning of the public sector undertaking like HAL, which has been in the forefront of making the aircraft in India. And you see, the problem is technology. We have not spent enough on technology development. Our problem in India has been that we've lagged behind in technology. So even though the SU MK1, MKI, which we were producing and we are continuing to produce, 30% of the critical parts still come from Russia. So therefore, they have the upper hand in terms of bargaining, and that is the problem that our defense, this thing, whether look at DRDO, look at the defense production. So what we need to do is accelerate technology development in our DRDO, accelerate technology development in our public sector units. But if we privatize, then they will simply get the technology from abroad. That's what was going to happen in Rafale. the technology transfer doesn't take place. Whereas what we need is technology transfer. And even from Soviet Union earlier and from Russia later on, we could not get the critical technology. So the issue is that how do we develop technology? Privatization will not necessarily lead to technology development. It is the public sector as a public service that technology development has to be accelerated. So therefore, if, as Mr. Venkatachalam is saying, that this move to corporatize and then to privatize, if that results in a lack of technology development, then the country will be set back. We are among the largest importers of defense equipment in the world, and this will continue, and that will weaken us because we have faced problems of at our borders, and technology supply can cease. So therefore, I think we need to take a strategic view of this corporatization of the defense establishments.
Sir, Professor Arun Kumar.
Sir.
Hello. Yes, I'm Srinivasan speaking. See,
Okay, yes, Mr. Srinivasan, go ahead. Yes.
I am putting this as a matter of devil's advocate. Actually, if you look at the New Delhi railway station, I've been here for 25 years. I know I have seen how I travel to New Delhi station, how the New Delhi station, railway station today, and say 20 years before. We also know the airport that we have seen in the Palam and the airport that we have now. Okay, we also know about the ports actually. So connecting this asset monetization scheme to equivalent to a privatization is something very, I'm also having some serious doubts. For example, if we are saying that there are 100 like so many railway stations, and if they are going to be the places, the housing colonies of the railway stations, due to the policies of the government, or even for the housing colonies, the government built houses now are empty because the housing rent allowance has been increased by the pay commissions, because of which many government employees are leaving the government quarters and going for the private housing. Okay, if that is the case, maintaining this government housing itself is a big challenge. When we are traveling in the railway stations, how many houses, dilapidated buildings are there in the railway stations actually. So if they are going to be utilized by the private sector, and if they are going to build new houses, or if they are building a commercial complexes, can't we see some kind of hope that they can be used? Because the employment is not going to increase. If you look at the employment data, organized sector employment over the last 15 years, particularly public sector employment is not going to grow. That means the housing colonies or housing sector, public, particularly the quotas, government quotas, they are not going to be filled up actually. So they are just getting dilapidated actually. So if you are utilizing for the as part of the scheme, what would be wrong? For example, in case of airports, how the poor is going to benefit, or by the, like for example, if the airports are going to be used as part of the scheme, how poor people will be losing. Rather, we need more investment in education, public investment in education, 6% GDP for the education sector. We need more and more hospitals. That's accepted. But port, for example, who is going to lose by say asset monetization scheme in port? The exporters. The exporters will benefit. So it's not the going. I'm really doubtful how the port will
Sir, please be brief because we are short of time. Sorry, sir. Just
we have to see that we cannot completely say equalize this issue of asset monetization scheme with the privatization. So we also have to see some hopes that can be utilized in a better manner, because building a house, a construction work in government sector is taking huge time. Suppose we are having we want to build a conference room today in my office. It takes about 7 years to get the building constructed actually. Such a huge inefficiency provides actually. So what is wrong in looking at this scheme in a positive manner?
So your question is clear, because we have slightly crossed the time. That's why I have to cut you short. So if this is your question, can we finish it here, sir? Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Thank you, sir. I have one more question. Do we have time? I'm asking both the panelists. Do you have time for one more question, sir?
Yeah.
So my question is this. To add on to Arun Kumar, sir, actually, in fact, in OECD test, OECD PISA test, India was ranked in the bottom. And I think in the last 6 years, ever since the Modi government came, they never wanted to do the test again. But my question is, see, the problem, this demand side is something that I'm not able to understand. Indians, for example, spend the highest percent of their per capita income on fuel, 17%. Maybe slightly closer to Pakistan. Apart from that, there's no other country. Even China, for example, they spend 2% of their income on fuel. So there's, and as Arun Kumar previously mentioned, we are depending on indirect taxes, and indirect taxes for a country with very high Gini index inequality is a disaster. And we have reduced corporate taxes. So the something is very basic. This is to propel the economy, you need to increase demand. And this is 12th standard economics. But why is this government not purposefully doing this? Purposefully, or are they still not aware of this? This is something that's remained a mystery to me, or a conundrum.
Well,
Okay, so,
yeah, very quickly, since you're running short of time and there are two questions. You see, what you must understand is that we are running by what is called the Washington Consensus. What Williamson in 1989 coined the Washington Consensus. And what is Washington Consensus? It implies it implies marketization of all policies. That means everything will be run according to market principles, you know. And the market principle runs on the basis of saying that, look, if the profitability is raised, then, you know, investment will come. But what it misses, this supply side, is the demand question that you are raising. So in a sense, you know, the Washington Consensus, it was also recognized by the World Bank, will result in more poverty because it is highly inequitable. You know, as Paul Krugman in a 2005 paper showed, that inequality in the USA in 2001 was greater than what used to be in the 1920s. So it was after the Second World War that the inequalities decreased, but the inequalities have been rising since after mid-70s, and that is the case everywhere in the country. And you can see the Delhi Socioeconomic Survey of 2018. You know, the Delhi Socioeconomic Survey of 2018 showed that 90% of the families in Delhi were spending less than 25,000 rupees per month. And, you know, 98% was less than 50,000 rupees per month. Now, Delhi's per capita income is 3 times the all India per capita income. That means at the all India level, the 90% families will be spending less than 10,000 rupees per month, you know. So in other words, there is a great deal of demand problem, because if 90% are spending only 10,000 rupees per month, then that's a problem. And that links up to the question that Mr. Srinivasan was asking. So it's not that airports and airlines are being used by the common man. The airports and airlines are clearly being used by the elite in the country, the top 3% in the income ladder, because only 2% of the Indians in Delhi are spending more than 50,000 rupees per month. So therefore, you know, it's true that, you know, this is not going to directly impact the poor people with this, you know, asset monetization, say, running, you know, thing. But certainly trains and the railway stations, they will affect the poor, because the poor use the railway station. And if you raise the ticket prices, because the elite trains will run and the railway stations will get commercialized and they will raise their charges, that will definitely affect the poor people. So in a sense, you know, what I was saying earlier, it's a philosophical question. What kind of capitalism do you want to run? Do you want to run a monopoly and oligopoly capitalism, or do you want to run a competitive capitalism? We are by no stretch of imagination a socialist economy. We have had a mixed model, and what we can characterize as state capitalism. The state-run capitalism has been there in the Indian context. So I think it is very clear that, you know, when, say, a land where the houses were there, which are now lying empty, then the question is, why would the private sector take over that brownfield project? It will not be required to do fresh construction. So those houses, what will you do with those decrepit houses? You know, so the point is, what you can do, the railways can also do. The railways, if it is permitted, they can also set up housing there. They can also lease out the housing. So what is it that the public sector cannot do, which the private sector can do? Or if the assets are taken over as they are, would the private sector be able to run it better than what the public sector was able to do? I doubt that. You know, so I think, you know, what Mr. Srinivasan was asking, that, you know, the New Delhi railway station has improved, you know, the airports have improved, etc. You know, but the point is that, you see, if you allow the public sector to do it, the public sector can also do it, right? And the public sector will then get the revenue stream from it, and that will then go into the budget. Whereas if you allow the private sector to do it, then that will go into the private stream, and that there will be a lot of cronyism and there'll be monopolies, which will create other problems. So I think that the question is not of some limited asset, but the question is of the wider understanding of how we should run the economy. What is our view of our society? A very poor society where 90% people in the pandemic said that they didn't have money to buy 1 week's ration. You know, that is the extent of poverty that exists in the country. So I don't buy the argument that we have only 22 crore below the poverty line, But in the pandemic, 23 crore more fell below the poverty line. And also, my argument is that at least 70% are poor. So if you're just above the poverty line, it doesn't mean that you're not poor. You remain poor, and 70% of the population remains poor. So we have to look at what is the kind of country you want to run for the 70% and not for the top 3%. What is happening is that we are running the country for the top 3%. So this idea that the private sector can, go in and create huge airports like Delhi and Bombay, have very fancy airports and run fancy airlines and, make New Delhi railway station very fancy. That doesn't take care of the poor. That in fact creates problems, as monopolies and oligopolies get created. So I think the wider philosophical question underlies all this, and that is what we need to address.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much. Sir, do you want to add something, sir? C.H. Venkatachalam, sir?
No. Just was thankful to you.
Okay. So I think we have extended the duration of the meeting by 10 minutes. So, but I think I'm really, really happy that both of you could join along with the Honorable Minister. I think it was a very interesting discussion. We had about 130 to 140 attendees, and also this videos would be edited in small videos. Each of your videos will be made as individual videos, and it will be transmitted across the state in different social media forms. So I think
does
this
the
will.
Honorable Finance Minister have any final comments? Because he had questions in the beginning, and we may not have addressed the questions that were there. Does he have any final comments?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. No, I was very happy to hear. I think a lot of good points were made, and I think the ideal situation, of course, is something you talked about, which is to move these out of the control of the bureaucrats and the executive to the legislature. Because if I was to talk the other side of this problem that I see, I completely agree with you that political interference in PSUs has been one of the biggest causes of the decay or the lack of good performance. I also feel that the alignment of politics has reached into the government unions, and you find that politics plays a role even there in terms of rather than for the workers, they're talking more about the parties. Also, when we try to price things for the public, for example, in Tamil Nadu, a lot of the benefits of the pricing go to the upper crust and not to the real common people. So though we give, for example, the first 100 units of electricity free, when we actually go and see where the subsidy in electricity is going, the greatest portion of the subsidy in electricity is going to people who use more than 500 units. In fact, we use more than 1,000 units because of the way this is structured. So there's not enough progressivity in the way things are done. Is this systemic, or is this an aberration? It's hard for me to say. And I think right now, for example, we have a dilemma where we have a bus stand that was built 100% on government funds, but it had some problems, corruption, so forth, which I've already listed while I was an opposition member. But now we have a situation where there are about 200 or 300 shops to be leased. Now, in normal circumstances, these kinds of leases, would also have corruption in them. But for example, we have just run a lease for a replacement of some shops around the temple, where the monthly rent income has gone up almost 10x because the auctions were run transparently. And since it was in my constituency and I'm the minister, I made sure there was no political interference. And so the fair auction yielded to the people 10x the monthly rent that we were getting in the old setup. So I think it's as much about execution as it is about philosophy or politics. Any model can be ruined by bad execution. Even a bad model can be leavened by good execution. And in the case of legislatures, I think there's a broader problem here. As I said when I was an opposition member, and I repeat when I'm a minister, that in many cases, the whole, the power of the legislature as envisioned in the Constitution already seems to have eroded greatly. And because of the partisanship that has developed and the anti-defection law and various activities, various shifts in the model, we are now in a situation where the legislature is mostly voiceless and just used as a rubber stamp. So I think there are some underlying problems, but certainly it was very thought-provoking, and I was taking notes copiously while you were speaking. I think some of these will certainly inform our internal discussions and our approach over time. So I just want to express my thanks to both of you for your insightful comments and for your taking the time and addressing the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bye.